Hello everyone, today we talk about the Jewish warfare during the First Jewish-Roman War, 66-73 AD. That marked a pivotal moment, as you know, in Jewish history arising from a complex interplay of religious, political, and social tensions between the Jewish population of Judea and their Roman overlords. Before 66 AD, Judea had, I will say, by the way, Judeans, not Judea, etc., had been under Roman control since 63 BC. This is an important date. We have to talk more about the late Republic. At this point, in fact, Pompey the Great intervened in the east. This is the same year which the Seleucid Empire had basically dissolved, and the Roman consul intervened in a Hasmonean civil war. The Hasmoneans were the essentially ruling dynasty of Judea from the 2nd century BC, so that the Romans reduced the region to a client state and later a province governed by Roman procurators. The Jewish people, lacking a standing military force of their own, as we will see now, were subject to Roman taxation, degree, of course, of cultural imposition, and occasional administrative abuses which fueled resentment to a degree. We talked about the traditional view of power and how this is exercised. It's never perfect, but there is a hierarchy of values that is based on force. And in fact, this period saw some degree, of course, of unrest, right, albeit sporadically. This is true. We've seen the history of different Roman provinces, and of course, in pre-industrial times, let's say, the coercive power of state was less intense. In any case, no organized military resistance until the outbreak of 66 really occurred. The immediate catalyst for the war was a series of provocative acts by the Roman procurator Gaius Florus, including the seizure of funds from the Jerusalem temple, which incited riots in the city. These disturbances escalated when Jewish rebels, emboldened by early successes, expelled Roman garrisons from Jerusalem and defeated a relief force led by Cassius Gallus at the Battle of Beth Horon. We are at the end of 66. This victory galvanized the Jewish population, sparking a broader revolt against Roman rule and briefly establishing a semblance of independence. Say they minted their own coins and they had an appearance of statehood. However, the rebels comprised really diverse factions. The Zealots, they were of course the more extremistic, the Sicari, and more moderate elements, united by their opposition to Rome, but often divided, in fact, by ideology as well as strategy. This, at the end of the day, was just a product of Jewish politics at the time and prevented, effectively, Jewish forces to even put together a force capable of resisting to the Romans for long. The Jewish war fought, as described by the historian Flavius Josephus, that, as you know, would become one of the most important sources in Roman history, would become friend with the emperor, etc. Was a survivor of the Jewish war after having led the rebels and fought against the Romans. In his works, the Jewish war, in fact, in Antiquities of the Jews, relied heavily on the resilience of improvisation of its fighters. Right? There was this greatly, in fact, mostly zealotic, fanatic, nationalistic, religious belief in the righteousness of the clash against Rome that fueled a great deal of moral force. However, without too much cohesion, compaction, as we were saying before, and especially a dramatic lack of military organization. Josephus knew better, by the way, because he was, as we just stated, a former rebel commander, eventually turned Roman captive, providing a detailed, if sometimes biased, account of the war. This depends, of course, of what side you want to watch, but it's really a reliable source that knew definitely how to tell the story. Initially, the rebels lacked a formal army, drawing instead on militias, defectors from the client king's forces, and hastily organized units. Their armament was rudimentary, often scavenged or locally produced, and their tactics leaned toward guerrilla rather than conventional engagements. We will understand today why. And despite these limitations, their early successes demonstrated a tenacity that definitely alarmed the Romans, who viewed Judea's strategic position near the eastern frontier as critical to imperial stability. By the way, there are 3 distinct Jewish wars. Another one in the 10s of the 2nd century AD. There is the other big one, Bar Kokhba revolt in the 30s. That I will discuss in another video. At least we will look at Bar Kokhba in a distinct video from this. Today we just look at the first Jewish-Roman war. Naturally, we will talk also about different military historical units. Here, if anything, there aren't specific battles such. There are very famous sieges, etc. But and so we'll talk partially about this too. But let's say this is just the first time we discuss Jewish warfare in some depth, and we will appreciate just the ensemble, like what were essentially the Jews fighting Rome like, right? And at some point we will also tell the whole story of the province, of the Roman government, and more, right? There is this backdrop of international tension between Rome and the East. I recently made a video about the Levantine provinces' rise, especially in the 2nd century AD. However, there was always that degree of Parthian infiltration that tended to harass the Levant and to hopefully reach the Mediterranean. So essentially the end of the Silk Route branches that were soundly controlled by the Romans. So this is especially evident in Bar Kokhba's revolt, a great deal of Arsacid backing against Rome, but in a way that the Parthians were particularly incapable of exploiting for some reason. And I made a video about the Parthian army organization, if anything, from actually like the 1st centuries, the 3rd, the 2nd BC. We will dive more into Persian warfare, also the Sasanian one that we started at some point, but we sort of rarely picked up again. Today we talk about this sort of general picture. Naturally, about the war, you know that Rome's response was decisive. After Gallus' defeat, Emperor Nero dispatched the seasoned general Vespasian, accompanied by his son Titus, to crush the rebellion. With a force of approximately 60,000 legionnaires and auxiliaries, Vespasian methodically reconquered Judea, exploiting the rebels' disunity and lack of cavalry. That, as we will see, would be a critical weakness against Rome's mobile and disciplined troops. The war culminated in the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, including the burning of the Second Temple, a catastrophe that, as you know, reshaped Jewish identity and religious practice for centuries. At large, this was the beginning of the Jewish diaspora, and at least in larger numbers, this would be enhanced also by the later revolts. Jewish communities existed in Rome since I think the 2nd century, the 3rd century BC or something. The Jews were already pretty much around, but this destruction changed a lot. We documented the deportation of the menorah to Rome. We also discussed this in the video about the Vandal sack of Rome, because there is always a circle here. It said that when Justinian, forces Belisarius reconquered to Africa, Tunisia, destroying the Vandals, the treasure, the Temple of Jerusalem, was brought back to Jerusalem in the Byzantine Empire. So there is a lot culturally that this war could provide for many videos, and surely we will talk more about Jewish history more. So religious practice, the Jewish worldview, but also the same Christian one, the same Roman one and beyond, really was affected by such outcome of the war. Before 66 AD, today, however, we stick to the military side of the story. By the way, we will talk about ancient Jewish warfare in many other circumstances, including Hellenistic battles. There is plenty of that. One of Schwerpunkt's earliest videos was the Battle of Ashdod, by the way, between the Jews, the Maccabees, and the Seleucids. That was quite interesting. So there is really a long history. We'll talk about, of course, Jewish militias during the Middle Ages as well. So there is plenty of stuff. I also have some basic Jewish history, mostly medieval Jewish history topics. We also talk about the Jews after the Battle of Vienna, 1683. So again, as always on Schwerpunkt, step by step, gradually. Today, however, we stick to the military side of the story again. So we have to picture first and foremost the background to the first Jewish rebellion. That is to say, by 66 AD, the Jewish population did not have an army. Right, this is really normal considering that this province of Judea has been effectively taken over by Rome and created as a province, established as a province, in fact. It was, as we were just recalling, just a very historical area, militarily wise. The Jews had developed their own culture, their own forces at some point as an independent kingdom that, however, had fallen under the influence of bigger powers, such as think about the Persians, if we go back in time, but, Alexander, the Diadochoi, Seleucids, Ptolemies, there were 5 so-called Syrian wars that were mostly fought between, fundamentally the Sinai and Lebanon, including Judea. So this is a very important, very old land with lots of history, stratified military experience, so to say. But of course, these Levantine powers were not particularly robust. Again, they had been, in this case, or even the Diadochoi ones, taken over by Rome, and there is no such thing like a permanent, statal, structured, professional military of sort like the Romans could have, like the same Diadochoi had, but also gradually degenerating over time, so that the Romans eventually took these places over. I would not digress on how, of course, the Semitic culture mentality, especially in this area of the Mediterranean, was informed by different attitudes towards God. So you can actually look at the Jewish revolts and noticing how, of course, fervently motivated that this people was, how they literally risked genocide. The term genocide is very often misapplied throughout history, and in ancient history there is no such a real thing like genocide, right? People, they're especially against Rome, and they want always to depict this dramatization of reality, think that genocide is a very specific term, and they confuse killing lots of people in wars like a genocidal purpose, right? Caesar in Gaul, oh my god, he wanted genocide. No, right? There were goals that he fought alongside with, and that were Romanized, and that kept speaking their language, and that wanted to be Romanized as well. The same goes for the Jews, except the Jews were really the people who went the closest at the time to be genocided. In fact, this is the case during the Jewish rebellions. There was a tiny elite, mostly, that sided with Rome, but the Romans exterminated large amounts of Jews during these rebellions that were a sort of Turkish shoot to a degree, considering the might of the Roman military, that, however, had to struggle in order to take down these forces. Think about the famous siege of Masada. Josephus being essentially the sole survivor of that, and so giving us this extraordinary insight, not much just on Jewish mentality that you can at large decipher from also the Old Testament, from the broader history of the region, etc. But the Roman one, some of the most beautiful pages written on Roman military ethos, positively depicting the Romans in that sense, come from Flavius Josephus. That was called like this, by the way, because he had, under the Flavians, become himself, favorite of the Roman emperor and embraced that Romanity as well. And this is beautiful, by the way, because it contradicts quite openly, together with Polybius, by the way, another exceptional foreign historian of Roman history, that history is written by the winners. You can argue that, of course, Josephus had sort of passed to the winner's side, but it's not quite the case in the sense that he was able, of course, to write about the Jewish struggle, also in terms that when you read these works, you realize they're not biased in the sense people are paranoid about today, as you can see on X, saying the exact opposite of reality and crying for, having for consideration, for being recognized as some kind of, a shadow, a person. Ancient historians had massive attributes, and they showed you how you could maintain, this is especially true within Romanity, your own identity by still being framed within the system and in this hierarchy of power, at the top of which Rome shone, right? So we know fairly a lot, after all, about this revolt that is, the other ones as well later, aside from what Josephus, in fact, could not, by that point, document anymore, that was actually a big deal, after all. And so that there aren't other parts of the empire where such kind of attitude towards leadership, such religious motivation played in the same way that it happened for the Jews in their homeland. So here we are really describing mostly the struggle of a people that did not have developed military means, that those had been politically, institutionally, historically worn out, right? It was just a Levantine kingdom at a point without much internal cohesion, and now already under Rome, that, however, had to confront the situation based on their choice to resist and to escalate and to go at war and to basically be exterminated, which is very fascinating from a political, cultural, and spiritual point of view. Now, through remarkable efforts in extraordinary circumstances, the Jewish combatants gained their independence. So first of all, they actually got that. They managed to take over the local Roman forces that were, of course, not actually many, because eventually Rome will make an extraordinary display of power to show the world, because this was an international big deal. We remember that before, as far as the Parthian aims were concerned, to show that Rome could deploy entire legions just to besiege single, isolated strongholds that were definitely, in strictly material terms, just a waste, right? The Romans could have accomplished that just with less losses, but here they had to show the world that if they wanted, they could. So showing an incredible amount of power, right? The Romans knew this well. That's also the same reason while in different political circumstances, for example, they had razed to the ground Corinth and Carthage, even though they were not a military threat to Rome, but to sort of dissuade the others to take any sort of unloyal stand. Now, the Jewish inherent resilience was unquestioned. Here we get it from the sources. This is not just a flattery or whatever. It's really like these people fought with a level of determination, of fanaticism, of commitment to the cause that is nothing short of extraordinary. Josephus comments, for example, on the concerns of the same Romans that definitely were not people who were really that thoughtful about. For them, they would just kill lots of enemies, and that was it. Wasn't a problem. And he noted instead that, quote, the Jews, I mean, this is what the Romans had noticed according to Josephus, the Jews possessed a fortitude of soul that could surmount faction, famine, war, and such a host of calamities. However, of course, the challenges of maintaining control over the territory they had won proved to be much greater than anticipated. Today, we will not make a politological analysis of the first Jewish-Roman war. Again, we will surely talk about this extensively in our Roman history content. Today, we just look at how the Jews fought, all right, in general. In the past decades, the Jewish king, Herod Agrippa, the client of the Romans, that fundamentally ruled over Judea, through such rulers, led a small army, which included a unit known as, quote, the Royal Spearmen, that may have incorporated Jewish soldiers proper. The reason why we say this is that of course, we were not overly informed about these client armies organization, of course, in detail, but we do know that there were other units within the army of Herod Agrippa that consisted of Thracians, Germans, and Gauls. This is fascinating because except the Germans, these peoples had already been conquered by the Romans. Certain Germans were actually Roman subjects as well, but it still shows how, for example, in the case of Gaul and Thrace, it's true that Thrace was not taken over by the Romans completely until Claudius, etc. But Gaul, right? You had here, we do not know who these people technically were, but the idea of having foreign mercenaries in your army, especially at high levels of relative professionalism, like guard units and forces you could more or less rule through, like as a king, like in this case, in the absence, in fact, of much larger forces to begin with, is still alive, still there, and it's normal, right? Having foreigners that, again, do not interfere with local politics, at least more than what the locals could do, is something we've seen really many circumstances. We made lots of videos from medieval times, like Muslim guards of Christian rulers and vice versa, etc. This entails, by the way, all previous degree. It's an important degree of international connection, because how do you get these peoples, by the way? It's not just like, Thrace may be even, of course, close to Levant, but what about Germany? What about Gaul, right? So there is an interesting movement of people that are under Roman rule that, however, find military, if I find an employment opportunity as soldiers in these peripheral client kingdoms of the empire, in different parts of the Mediterranean. There is here a heavy, this is very important to stress, a very heavy Hellenistic legacy. Right, the Jews had been soaked into that. They had been part of Alexander's empire since the early days. They had really witnessed, as we were saying before, a lot of warfare on their land between the Syrians and the Egyptians, in which they themselves acted as proxies, fundamentally. So we surely know, we could make at some point some video about what's this, a Thracian soldier in the army of Herod Agrippa in Judea would have looked like, right? And surely we would see lots of arms and armor that would be reminiscent, of Pergamon's altar or stuff like that. These rulers were also fairly rich, by the way, so surely their guard units were very well equipped. This is not for us today to express, also because this monarchy did not exist anymore at the time of the revolt. However, we're talking essentially a generation before, so more or less there would have been even some of the same people in charge. When we look at these societies, we also realize that there were not just militias, and of course, like peasant levies could be potentially armed across the territory, as it would happen during this uprising, at least to some extent, because we'll see that actually armament was pretty scarce, but still the will was there. But there were in fact, militias, also some forces connected just with the most important institutions. For example, the Temple of Jerusalem. It's in fact likely that the Temple Guard contributed at least a few trainers, at least. This was true for Jewish rulers that, after all, aside from the beliefs of these foreigners we've seen that they hired from around the world, were of course cultivating a specifically Jewish worldview and sort of power displays or religious ethos that could quite galvanize the spirits, as it was the case already for the Jewish people in their historical vicissitudes, and even more now in the anxiety to sort of get rid of the Romans, although temporarily, in fact, as we'll see now, without too much of a chance, not even a direction in hindsight. Now, according to Josephus, the, quote, most distinguished Jewish warriors at the Battle of Beth Horon included Niger of Perea and Silas the Babylonian, that were both experienced defectors from Agrippa II's forces. So these were previous officers in the Jewish army at significant level. In fact, along with Monobazus and Kenedaius, members of the royal family of Adiabene. The Battle of Beth Horon was a significant military engagement that occurred in 66 during the war. It took place near the village of Upper Beth Horon and Lower Beth Horon, located in a strategic pass northwest of Jerusalem. This battle was a notable early victory for the Jewish rebels against the Roman Empire and highlighted the challenges Rome faced in suppressing the revolt. Cassius Gallus advanced towards Jerusalem, but faced continuous harassment from Jewish fighters along the way. After failing to decisively capture the city and suffering losses in skirmishes, he decided to withdraw his forces northward through the Beth Horon Pass. This again, narrow, steep, and rugged, ideal as a route for ambushes. The Jewish rebels, led by commanders such as Simon bar Giora and other zealot leaders, capitalized on this retreat. As the Roman column entered the pass, the Jews attacked from the surrounding heights, raining down projectiles and launching surprise assaults. The terrain prevented the Romans from effectively deploying their disciplined formations, and their heavy armor and equipment slowed them down. The Jewish forces, familiar with the landscape and using guerrilla tactics, inflicted heavy casualties. The Romans suffered a devastating defeat. Cassius Gallus lost approximately 5,700 soldiers, including legionnaires and auxiliaries, along with significant equipment such as siege engines and the legion's eagle standard, an immense disgrace in the Roman military culture. Gallus himself barely escaped with his life, and the survivors retreated in disarray to Antioch. All right. Speaking of Adiabene, by the way, because there were these other client kingdoms that were historically connected in the Levant, was a small, semi-independent realm in northern Mesopotamia, located roughly in the region of modern-day northern Iraq, east of the Tigris River. At the time of the Battle of Beth Horon, it was a vassal state of the Parthian Empire, which dominated much of the Near East as a rival to Rome. Its capital was Arbela, modern Erbil, and its territory stretched between the Upper Zab, that is the Leucas, and Lower Zab, Capros rivers, though its borders fluctuated over time, occasionally including cities like Nisibis and Nineveh, even. So we understand in this case that there were foreign officers that were sent by the Parthians to fight the Romans during the Jewish uprising. This happened also during the time of Bar Kokhba, even though there wasn't much of an Arsacid success in all this, or even just particular capability in exploiting the situation. And at some point for Rome was, as you have seen here, pretty serious. Experienced officers from foreign armies were presumably valued for their professionalism in otherwise amateur military. Again, the Jews were in part demilitarized by the Romans, of course. Instead, when you look at the Middle East and this other sort of, in this case, Persian client states, there is a higher degree of political decentralization, fragmentation. So you have locally a bit more of sort of warlikeness. This is true also, for example, in Armenia, that, as you know, is particularly distant and difficult to access, at least especially when the local rulers become proxies for, in fact, Rome and Parthia, where you have, in that case, a higher level militarization. In the Levant, there wasn't so much. You can check, by the way, the history of other Roman provinces out that I discussed in some videos about this. Now, while nominally overseeing the war effort, the Jewish people's conservative council's main focus was on preserving the existing social religious order. Right, it was quite difficult for them to maintain order, control, hierarchy, and discipline in this situation, because it wasn't just about fighting the Romans, but also different groups in the historically quite effervescent Jewish theological landscape. Think even about, I don't know, the influence of certain regions from which by which Christianity itself had historically been fueled, and the fact that the kingdom, what had been the kingdom of Judea, had just recently expanded in part in the fringe, in the periphery of this. I inserted some maps here, but at the time of Herod, basically Herod II, the areas like Galilee, right, or Perea, had been annexed just by the will of Emperor Caligula, right, that had also donated other territories further northeast that were actually not Jewish even. There was the realm of Herod from Chalcis further north, basically northwest of Damascus, right? So here, Jewish rulers, together with other Levantine dynasties, tended, of course, to play with Rome an interesting game of sort of political territorial recompaction. But of course, the internal order of this was much more complicated, especially in times of upheaval such as this. And it's obvious that the most fanatic fringes tended also to see this revolt as an opportunity to seize with force what they could have not done not just under Rome, but under a sort of more stable Jewish authority. Now, the conservative council aimed to recruit militia fighters willing to accept the authority of the military governors appointed in Jerusalem into formal government units. So some sort of regular army that, of course, had its limitations, but at least in political terms could be trusted. Josephus highlights this process by detailing a detachment sent from Jerusalem to Galilee in the north, which included 600 men who were paid in advance for 3 months, alongside 3,000 civic troops known as politai in Hellenic. That was essentially the lingua franca, right, of the Eastern Roman Empire, also in fact in these Jewish lands, and 100 regulars called hoplitai, in fact. So this is fascinating, because 600 men paying in advance for 3 months are basically telling you how scarce this Jewish governmental control really was, and resources at large, right? Yes, you had this other 3,000 civic troops, politai, but these are sort of less, those are militias, right? The aforementioned 600 are proper professional soldiers of some sort, presumably drawn also from those kind of men that, as we've seen, had served in the previous Jewish monarchic forces, and so with an important degree of experience. We find this 100 proper regulars called hoplites that may represent some sort of civic militia. Remember that the term is pretty vague. It's not like the Jews fought as hoplites necessarily. I mean, they would have fought as heavy spearmen, of course, and that was enough sort of to call them hoplites by assonance with the Flavius Josephus is writing in Greek. That's why we know, right? So that's obviously would have been interesting to know it in Hebrew. We understand this being some sort of better body compared to the politai, some sort of heavier force, but hey, it's just 100, right? So these troops revolved more or less around Jerusalem, which, as you know, will be besieged and stormed by the Romans. And so these are basic forces you want to keep there in or around to stiffen resistance, to maintain, say, to defend from a siege, having something to truly rely on with some kind of broader motivation, pay, quality of some sort, political affiliation. This illustrates the new government's attempt to establish a formal army in hopes of gaining military superiority over, at least also, this is very important, the independent militias, and reducing the risks posed by various armed revolutionary groups that were dangerous for such authority. Of course, they had control over, as we'll see now, larger forces in the tens of thousands. The problem was, however, the lack of resources to sort of discipline them, train them, arm them in a way that could be a challenge for the Roman legions. That, of course, were the biggest deal of all in this. But it's still a complicated situation for Rome because it's still, again, a major rebellion. It's a Mediterranean country, so the Romans have at this point all the advantage in supplies, logistics, etc. But it still requires a long war to be waged relatively far away from what is effectively the center of the empire. Now, at the start of the Jewish rebellion in 66 AD, the military organization of the Jews, as we just explained, was really minimal. One of the regional leaders, the historian Josephus himself, sought to rationalize his forces, and he told us in his history. He ultimately organized a contingent of 250 cavalry, a hand-picked bodyguard of 600 infantry, 4,500 well-trained full-time fighters, an additional /alleged 60,000 infantry with, in fact, only half available for duty at any time. Which makes sense, however. That's why it's also not really an exaggeration. The point is what kind of control he had. 250 cavalry is important because, as we'll see now, the Jews actually had very few cavalry in general. This was a grave limitation to their tactical and operational capacities. There's this bodyguard of 600 infantry, so this would be elite fighters. Then you have 4,500 soldiers of some sort. So they are trained, they are reliable, they have experience, degree of professionalism. Then you have this rabble, fundamentally. You can call as a general levy, just as cannon fodder, so to say, and that you marginally rely on because you basically just can call them to arms based on their general feeling, like whatever they feel like in terms of military participation or uprising against the Romans, but there is nothing really permanent or stable about them. We will see now how these troops were equipped. You immediately imagine the difference between the opposite ends of this organization. Now, most other leaders, next to Josephus, seemed content to assemble large infantry numbers without much organization or training. That's why Josephus was maybe a bit biased, like he was saying, well, I actually commanded the best, but it may have been even the case, right? Just we think that overall his army organization more or less reflected in proportion to one of the broader Jewish rebels, right? That, by the way, tended to frequently clash among themselves. On top of this is an underrated aspect of the story and telling you immediately how much chaos really existed from the Jewish side in this picture, which is the recipe for disaster. Now, the common perception of the Jewish fighters depicts them as lightly armed individuals who preferred slings, bows, and javelins, eschewing armor. This is largely correct. That's what those troops would have roughly been about. These are peasants. They have barely anything more than that. Even more, they're not well trained, so they lack cohesion. reason for which they can't participate to military operations, but just as minute men, right? So throwing what they had against the enemy, running as fast as lightly as they were equipped. Paradoxically, this would have been even the most motivated fighters, because they were really the ones who suffered the most, who lived under the Roman yoke, who felt the most like sort of the dire straits of their social situation. But as it always happens, like, it can be very morally loaded from an individual point of view, but not so. Being actually very good as a guerrilla fighter, as many of these Jews would actually turn out to be, but still fighting as guerrilla fighters, meaning that you admittedly don't have the strategic capacity to take on an enemy face to face, and needing to go out there, right, in the bushes, trying to survive while chased down by the Roman military. Naturally, these forces were agile, but without fortified positions, they struggled against the overwhelming force of the legions, particularly in provincial encounters, meaning that, of course, the outer, the circle here, and the smaller the garrisons, the smaller the fortification, so it would have been even easier for the Romans to simply march through. Jerusalem and a few other locations were a bit a tougher nut to crack, even when, again, they were manned by such relatively low quality troops. I mean, that's the beauty, let's say, of ancient medieval warfare, as we described many times. And even a handful of determined people, read Masada, they could pin down considerably larger Roman forces. When you add this extra religious fanaticism from the Jewish side, you really can have important results. Most rebel fighters engaged as loosely organized infantry, wielding javelins and sidearms like swords or curved knives. You have these similarities with the Thracian Sicae, for example. I'm preparing a video about Thracian infantry, by the way, that we do know, as we've seen, fighting in Judea for the same local rulers in the previous generations, and it's possible that, again, through this broadly sort of multicultural Hellenistic military background, the Jews may have adopted specific weapons that were very good for, again, this hit-and-run tactics. In fact, this is what exactly the Thracians historically were. They had very light, fast-moving infantry, and so it's possible that that bias was transferred to the Jews due to some Thracian units that had been part of the Jewish monarchy's army. We shouldn't, however, think that all Jews were, at least the rank and file one, would be specifically just skirmishers, light infantrymen. For example, we see even on the coins minted by the Romans after the Jews were captured, there is the trophy with the spoils, etc., the weapons. You realize that there were, for example, long shields, right? Also some interesting design that looks like, in some cases, here I inserted it. Again, it's the Romans depicting it, but they would have still represented something likely that looks a bit like Germanic shields as well. Designs, those hexagonal ones. The point being that there was surely something slightly heavier than what we stereotypically make these Jewish warriors about. The reason fundamentally being that, of course, most of them would have been light troops, but we see greaves, we see even quadrangular shields of sort, heavy helmets, also not necessarily of Roman design, because as you can imagine, they would fight with Roman weaponry. We will talk about this in a while. The idea of having long shields can be connected also with particularly light shields, the designs of which, however, was conceived to cover, like, as much as, in fact, pretty lightly or armored or unarmored, completely unarmored forces. So that is part of the picture, but in this sense, the average Jewish fighter would have not differed from sort of the average Tureoforos broadly meant. I made a bit about the Tureophoroi, including actually the Jewish ones, now that I remember from the previous era. So if you're interested, I will post this down below, the top fixed comments, related videos, links, that really tells you more or less how, in fact, not much had really changed across the centuries. The Levant, especially Asia Minor, but this was true for the entire Mediterranean and sedentary Europe, provided this lighter, this typical guy that is basically a guy with a helmet, an oval shield of sort, a couple of javelins / spears, maybe a side weapon, and that's it. All right, so the Jews do actually fight pretty much in the same way, especially when we look at the heavy infantry of some sort, because the Tureophoroi are fundamentally heavy infantry. They're, let's say, heavy in the sense that they can take on enemy missile troops, right? They're not as heavy as, I don't know, the heaviest of the Roman legionnaires, right? But they will also have their own equivalent for that matter. So the important is that they can stand their ground, they can form up a line. And as we'll understand here, the point was not much how likely the Jews were equipped, but how scarcely collectively trained they were, and how much sort of lack of arms development, of coordination tactically they lacked, right? So that in open field the Romans would really raise them. Like they could and would resort to ambushes, to guerrilla, exactly for this reason, because they realized that in open field they would have gotten the worst of it. Some Jews, as we were saying just right now, chose to use bows instead of javelins and shields, especially the poorest ones of all, so that you're not even supposed to come to grips with the enemy, unless you want to sack the enemy camp or take on the field aids or something. But these guys are just there to shoot arrows that are just a scratch, like for a Roman legionnaire at large. But that altogether, repeatedly, during an attritional guerrilla warfare, can take their toll. A minority would have been javelin skirmishers, likely carrying smaller shields of varying designs that we also don't know too much about. But this, again, would have been pretty similar to basically any other Hellenistic area that had historically disarmed the subjects. Would have reduced, like, the average fire in this context, just like a guy who could literally build a small shield on his own, and finding or creating a javelin on his own as well, and going at war like that. Those are not forces you can hold the line with, right? They're just auxiliaries. They will support you as skirmishers in the opening phase, like of a clash between two battle lines. Although a limited amount of captured auxiliary equipment was accessible, it was insufficient to equip all combatants. Thus, armor was probably worn mainly by officers. Captured artillery saw use, and while the Jews crewmen initially struggled, they improved their efficiency with experience. This may seem unimportant because we do know how sort of contained the importance of artillery was in ancient warfare, right? We often get this, torsion catapults to be just like, 20th century artillery shelling. This is, of course, not how this worked. Artillery, however, at the time was very important in siege warfare, and given that, as we will see now, essentially the Jews quickly gave up like open field confrontations with the Romans. Most of the story got down to attritional sieges. Even among the defenders, having, of course, ballistas, other catapults, etc., was very important, and the Jews learned how to operate the systems. Of course, the Romans had also the best artillery crews. They were truly professional in nature. Again, the Jews had not properly the infrastructure, the level of military production of the Romans, but they learned how to use scorpions, ballistas, etc., the best they would. It's just they were fighting with Roman equipment, and again, warfare in technical terms at the time was just overall much simpler. Now, in Jerusalem, the Jewish militias that from the bigger center were also the strongest at large appeared, in fact, to have had a more organized structure. Their armament may have come from 5 key sources. The Herodian armories looted at the war's outset, because those would have been kept under control by the same Romans. Ongoing production from Jewish workshops, that of course in Jerusalem existed as together with a craftsmanship estate, so to say. Purchases from arms dealers, supplies from deserters, and weapons taken from slain enemies on the battlefield. Right? Remember the Battle of Beth Horon before, but let's see it. Parthian and Parthian allies supplies that kept the Jewish struggle going on for a while. A certain degree of illegal weaponry for this reason was already present under Roman rule, right? Supplemented by armaments acquired from garrisons that were overtaken by the rebels. While acquiring military skills was more challenging, the significant influx of equipment from these latter sources was relevant. It's rather, however, the disordered nature of the combat witnessed during the final decisive battles on the Temple Mount that really highlight the general lack of coordination. Again, technology does not make wars. Arms per se do not make countries win. After Vespasian became emperor in 69, his son Titus led the Roman legions, including the 5th, 10th, and 15th legions, totaling 60,000 troops to besiege Jerusalem. By summer 70 AD, the Romans breached the city's outer walls and advanced towards the Temple Mount. The rebels, now consolidated under Shimon bar Giora and John of Giscala, made their last stand there. On August from the 9th to the 10th, around the traditional date of Tisha B'Av, Titus' forces stormed the Temple Mount after weeks of bombardment with siege engines. Despite orders to preserve the temple, Roman soldiers enraged or accidentally set it ablaze, destroying it. This is told us by Josephus, Book 6, 220-270. Fierce fight occurred on the temple platform with Jewish defenders killed or captured. As we already pointed out, one persistent flaw in the Jewish military persisted throughout the campaign: the virtually complete lack of one ounce cavalry force that significantly hampered their war effort, as they failed to devise an effective counter to the Roman cavalry threat. I made a video, by the way, on the quality of Roman cavalry that, of course, was notoriously high at this point, but that people don't realize being somehow stronger than we imagine. Admittedly, that video was talking about earlier eras, for which we tend to think that, at least people, for some odd reason, always tended to think Romans had weak cavalry. It wasn't at all, right? Romans had very good cavalry, at most just containing numbers, but because they could rely on other people's cavalry by this point. But even their few turmai were pretty darn good in the legion. Now, repeatedly, when the Romans managed to draw or force the Jews onto flat terrain, the latter suffered devastating defeats. This seems kind of obvious. You have this large numbers of fundamentally untrained, professionally untrained infantry, like a lighter type. You don't have cavalry to the point of being able to meet the Romans on equal grounds. It's all about combined armed tactics. The Jews did not have, say, enough missile power to add to something in that sense. And in general, without cavalry, you lack the shock effect as well. So this wouldn't end well to begin with. Again, it's not much about, of course, the quality of Roman infantry. That was something, incredible for the times. Beings, and Josephus leaving us, again, some of the most beautiful description of properly the Roman legionary spirit manifesting in literally as they opened to the world that they had to take over by God's order. Consequently, the war devolved into a series of sieges, right? The Jews defending demonstrated remarkable resolve, with some fanatical garrisons preferring death to capitulation on 2 occasions, which Josephus was also witnessed to. Once the Jews were trapped within their cities, the Romans advanced methodically, using their superior artillery and tactics of starvation to achieve victory. At that point, basically, you're simply mastering the initiative, right? The Jews cannot do much in open field. They will make sorties, they will try to harass your supply lines, etc. But again, this is most of what they can actively do. They're declaring their strategical inferiority. And so you have all the time, after all, by the way, at the peak, not even yet at the peak of Roman military power, just essentially sitting there, choking these guys ever more, and then finally storming, because you're not there just for free either, right? So it's not just about waiting for them to surrender. The Romans would keep themselves occupied on a regular basis. They would build this massive ramp. Mazadas, one is still visible. They would find incredible engineering solutions to quite, difficult military problems, and they would work best, right? The Roman legionnaires, which were basically all what the Roman military was, strictly meant, the Roman citizenry, that were the auxiliaries, but they were fundamentally assault engineers. This is what they were professionally trained for, and so this was their element, totally. And of course, they would excellently perform. They surrounded the besieged cities with entrenchments to prevent any sorties or external relief efforts, bombarded fortifications with various artillery, including large 3-stone throwers that were really described most at this time, were essentially the most powerful artillery in an antiquity that found extensive employment. A notable tactic involved the deployment of fully armored soldiers wielding long spears to lead assaults, likely drawn from mounted cataphracts provided by the client kings of Emesa and Commagene, because of course that proxy war in the Middle East was going on, right, with some of these realms siding with Rome, others with the Parthians. I made a video about Cappadocia, if you're interested. There's a Roman province that tells you a bit of that situation. So the Jews were not, of course, the only ones receiving help from abroad. The Romans too were supported in exchange for other favors, etc. So this was simply Rome had the upper hand by far in the picture, both locally and internationally. You understand the sense of Roman magnitude even just by the massive show-off that the legionaries made of their engineering, technological capacities. Again, the story of the stone throwers is just show you what we can do. It's just like, I don't know, today using ballistic missiles or something. Of course, it's a different game there, also depending on what you arm the ballistic missiles with. But I mean, in general, it's just something like these are the best power that we have around in terms of hitting at distance, destroying with large force that nobody else, by the way, can match. Right, so the Romans have literally the best military around under every point of view. This dynamic played a significant role in a crucial turning point of the war, which transpired even before Vespasian arrived in Judea. The Romans had basically gotten this, right? Energized by their success in repelling Gallus, the Jerusalem junta initiated a major expeditionary force aimed at capturing the city of Ascalon, primarily due to its historical hostility towards the Jews and recent violent actions against the Jewish community. The Jews had had to struggle with this other Canaanite and population. They made views on this for quite a long time. The Jews had greatly expanded in the last centuries all around, properly as a state, as a power, and so in part they were they were contrasted by these lesser communities that had, like by now, fallen under Jewish power, but harbored their resentment against them. So there is really a lot of interplay. Ascalon on the coast also has that broader strategic relevance. It can sort of unite better the Jewish domains if controlled. And in fact, strategically, this assault made sense. Ascalon's coastal position could allow the Jews to attack from the rear while the main Roman offensive advanced from the north. Because, of course, like the Roman military here was being served also, as it would happen, I don't know, during the Crusades with the Crusaders themselves, like from the sea, right, roughly and easily, like all the supplies you could send to the Roman military here, 60,000 men, would arrive more easily from different parts of the Mediterranean, not to create strain on the surrounding provinces that would also contribute, importantly, of course, to the struggle. So it's an interesting game. The importance of this mission is highlighted, by the way, by the fact that the Jewish junta committed its entire mobile reserve, totaling 20,000 men under trusted leaders, John the Essene, Niger the Perean, and Silas the Babylonian that we mentioned in part also before. This is a considerable strategic force in the tens of thousands. It makes sense, by the way, these numbers are realistic, like they're plausible. This three-pronged attack was well organized as well, with Niger of Perea leading the southeastern approach from Idumea, Silas of the Babylonian advancing from the east, and John the Essene launching his offensive from the north surrounding Joppa, where he had been appointed commander by the rebel movement. This tells you, of course, that there is Jewish hinterland in control of its own resources. There is de facto effective government in Jerusalem that coordinates these actions. There is a broader strategic vision and coherence in the plan. But not everything goes well. Ascalon was protected merely by a single cohort of infantry, potentially bolstered by local auxiliary forces and an ala of cavalry, totaling fewer than 1,000 soldiers from the Roman side. The idea of the cohort as a garrison force, right, controlling some provincial areas is very important in the logic of the Roman organic development from different centuries. I made multiple videos on the Roman cohort and why it came about, fundamentally. That is not much a tactical but a strategical reason. In fact, here the Romans get the upper hand. A remarkably astute commander known only as Antonius effectively defended Ascalon against Jewish forces. He recognized his strengths, discipline, and mobility, and knew how to leverage them efficiently. So this gives you a dimension, as we were saying, because it's one of the few circumstances in which the Romans are actually besieged, and how here a force that he is remarkably inferior from a numerical point of view could hold out, in fact, much larger forces, thanks to the inherent quality of the Roman military and just also the genius of his leadership in this case. When the Jewish forces assembled at Ascalon, they charged directly at the city. Instead of retreating behind its walls, Antonius positioned his cavalry on the flat terrain outside and then initiated his attack. This is a bold proposition, right? It's the acknowledgement that you're basically given up all kind of defensive capacity to actually meet an enemy in open ground and showing off like what you can achieve. And this circumstances tells you the sheer principle of force, right? And Antonius here evidently knew well, as the Jewish fighters lacking discipline and adequate armament and fighting on foot stood little chance. This is incredible. As Josephus recounts, quote, when untrained recruits faced seasoned troops, infantry confronted cavalry, disorganized fighters matched against coordinated soldiers, and those armed with inferior weapons faced fully equipped legionaries. While emotion guided the former and discipline steered the latter, the outcome was predetermined. Of course, these are harsh words that are also designed, as we were saying before, to present like a favorable picture of the Romans. That as a military force was essentially to triumph over the Jews, in order at least to expectedly be a superior one, and contrasting, in fact, this kind of wishful thinking steered by emotions rather than practicality. Of course, reality would have been a bit more balanced in the sense there are just different examples of military actions that we know just through single sources. So, of course, we don't have to be too hasty to judge here. But when you look at the broader outcome of the war, you also realize that the Romans, did really have the upper hand. It wasn't easy for them to prevail in absolute terms, but definitely in relative terms, they did have an edge, right? And in general, like you would imagine such uprising to be quelled. I mean, what could the Jews really do alone against the entire might of the Roman military? At the peak, you could say, if not yet, by the way, of imperial power. Josephus notes, by the way, that on that occasion at Ascalon, the Jews suffered 10,000 fatalities, including notable commanders John the Essene and Silas the Babylonian themselves, whose deaths were particularly detrimental to their cause. As we've seen, these were experienced generals. They were the top commanders of the Jewish military. So this is a very powerful picture. Again, not just the Romans accept the fight, but they even simply think that it's better, easier for them to just confront the Jews in open field, because if there are so many, here, by the way, there are all the 20,000, right, of the force we were talking about before, and so 20 to 1, the Romans recognize the inherent weakness of the Jews in their lack of coordination. The Romans had surely some, again, more tactically complete and military experienced force. However things went that we can't fully know, the picture is quite plausible. If you consider, again, most Jewish troops to be mostly the aforementioned peasant rebels that would have not really contribute in qualitative terms to the clash, more than much, if anything, adding to chaos. Despite witnessing the carnage of their fallen comrades, the Jews launched another assault the next day, though, which tells you how sort of determined they were at large, and how they didn't see this necessarily as more than a setback. This, however, resulted in an additional 8,000 casualties. So this basically cripples the entire Jewish strategic effort. Niger, who had previously been considered lost, eventually returned to the rebel ranks. However, his survival offered little comfort in light of the substantial destruction of the Jewish field army, which, according to Josephus, endured thus in total a staggering 90% casualty rate over the 2-day failed campaign. This seems just the entire picture. In fact, this catastrophe explains why the Jewish leadership did not provide troops to Josephus in Galilee, as he says, despite his urgent requests. Again, he was operating in the north. This was a more southern theater. The Romans were pressing from different sides, starting to respond to the insurrection. Instead, the Jews instructed Josephus to gather whatever local fighters he could muster. Aside from the personal guards held by members of rival factions, there was virtually no remaining central reserve at this point. Even the peasantry at this point had been basically demotivated just to fight again. They were mostly all what they could put together with great difficulty, but with initial elan. And so just from a psychological point of view, seeing your forces slaughtered this brutally, by the way, the Romans would have not gone easy on these guys, all right? Even with a few hundred cavalrymen, you can cut down all those tens of thousands of peasants like grass while they're routing. So it's really bloody mess, and it doesn't help really anyone. In here, the Jews were definitely too bold. As a direct result of the Ascalon defeat, the balance of power thus shifted irrevocably from the Jews to the Romans. At this point, basically, the Jews are just shutting themselves into their fortifications, into Jerusalem, waiting for the unavoidable Roman storm. The setback humbled the same rebel leaders that at this point were the direct responsible for having gotten so many people killed from their side, prompting them to adopt the wholly defensive approach by securing fortified locations and neglecting, by the way, the lesson of Beth Horon, which had suggested, of course, like a motivated Jewish force, even without too much pre-gress collective training, in an ambush guerrilla fighting style could be actually very effective against the Roman legions, right? Knowing the terrain, exploiting also the agility of troops, like mastering different militia groups from different parts of Judea, they could really infest the Romans, harassing them and luring them into a trap, right? This is something which we've seen also in other, the Battle of Athens was something relatively similar. Speaking of the same region, of course, I'm a medievalist, I have to make that example, so I made a video on that battle. So this is the failure of Jewish leadership at this point, which, by the way, lost heart, right? And withdrew in this kind of now unavoidable death game, right, of lasting till the end. They had not been able to visualize the necessity of destabilizing the Roman legions during their movements through challenging terrain and exploiting, again, the advantages that the Jews had in their own regard. Rather than gradually facing a war of attrition against Jewish guerrilla forces, Vespasian and Titus from their side were able to systematically isolate and dismantle their strongholds one by one. This was clever because it sort of slowed a bit down the pace of action, but they understood themselves that it was useless to risk everything with bolder actions. The Roman military, again, was not there for playing. They understand, okay, we are superior, all right, so the Jews have received this very heavy blow, but they could still resort to some kind of attritional warfare. We don't have to spread out too much. We don't have to give them disadvantage. Sieges are a challenge, not just because of the complications of storming, so besieging a fortification and surrounding it, building siege machinery, really keeping on the pressure on the enemy defenses till the final storming with the legionnaires that would have at least excelled properly to that fate, because that's what, again, Roman legionnaires were properly conceived for. Lots of auxiliaries lost their lives. Of course, the Romans at some point were ambushed here and there. The sieges themselves offered like sort of a stationary position that the Jews could attack, especially harassing the enemy supply lines. But by now, the Jews do not have that critical strategic reserve, enabling them to carry out complicated maneuvers at a regional level to, say, cut off the Roman supply lines, as they had envisaged they could do at Ascalon. So, one or another, the Romans are strong in attack. They're even stronger in defense. Of course, so the Jews do not have much advantage. They do not venture out there. And one by one, these various strongholds, although bravely resisting most of the cases, they are taken down by imperial forces. The political ramifications of Ascalon were similarly profound. The leaders of the Jewish militias, as we've seen, lost confidence in their ruling junta's capacity to conduct the war. Rather than integrating their personal forces into a unified, centralized command, they opted to maintain their independence. By the way, is from a cultural point of view, all the various Jewish sects are jealous of their own position, of their own origins. As we've seen, this is a fairly composite territory. So again, there is a centrality of Jerusalem that is eventually taken over. With that, the entire country at large, like what was Samaria, Idumea that we mentioned before, was with Jerusalem, it would fall. The same goes for Perea and Galilee. And so at large, also some of these centers would have just reopened the gates to the Romans that surely were not very tender with those who had opposed them, but of course were not trying to complicate the situation in such sort of irritable land, to put it in these terms. Of course, it was a disaster for the Jews. It sort of made them lose so much relevance in the empire as well. And in great part, this had been caused by the severe undermining of any potential for collective action and the exacerbation of factional discord due to this previous political background of the Jewish factions. The outcome was even a peculiar situation because this war did not have, for example, any major open field confrontation. Beth, Horon, and Ascalon, again, are not really open grounds, as we've seen. The one is an ambush, the other is part of a siege, fundamentally. So everything ends up with just sieges, right? Which is not even too strange. In the bigger picture, if it weren't for the fact that normally, like, to take people down, at least it would be some major showdown at a point. Here, just sieges. And again, considering the premises, it's at least understandable. Yeah, ironically, by retreating behind the walls of their various fortifications, including Jerusalem, the Jews inadvertently facilitated a Roman engagement on their own preferred terms. Logistics, supply chains, and the meticulous methodology of siege warfare that the Romans were really top at, even before their open field capacities were really excellent at that point. So it's a story that we don't even need to conclude, because that's better for also a deeper take on, again, Jewish history, the role in the empire, and in later times as a consequence of the First Jewish War. In another video, we will look at Bar Kokhba revolt, because that is pretty far away. Like, people from the first revolt would have barely remembered, right? Like as babies. That, again, people mostly lived like 70 years if they surpassed their teenage. They survived up to adulthood. They had chances to arrive at 60, at 70 or something, but it's another world, it's another picture that has been molded also by the First War anyway. So the political and religious ethos of Bar Kokhba are also more relevant to an extent in that final third war. There is, again, also the one of the diaspora in 115-17, but it's a bit like another story. There are, again, very famous battles that at some point we will look at in depth, such as the siege of Masada. Sometimes I did sieges. We talk about Acre, by the way. Masada is close to the Dead Sea, on the Dead Sea practically, in Idumea, where the same Josephus told us the most terrifying story of how the Jews were able really to fight and die that willingly. And so that's always a problem, regardless of your military advantage. If you have people who are willing to do so, there is a dysfunctionality. It's just like, I don't know, the Japanese kamikazes. If you really need to fight like that, like using planes just to crash into carriers, it means you're losing the war, point, because that's not a functional military tactic at large, and that's how it ends. But at large, other people will die from the other side, and so it's a problem as well. You lack there properly a dialogue, right? And we have, by the way, to talk more about Jewish and Christian history of this early, especially at this stage, because I realized that for a channel that discusses heavily traditional and Christian history, also we really need to integrate these topics more often. There surely is going to be some kind of of connection here, but I don't know how soon. It's important to realize the let's say the military essence of these encounters, just to also appreciate the life of the time, like how these peoples would conceive the world, their existence, etc. So it's something very difficult actually to do, especially when you are confronted with these openly suicidal engagements at a point. And so reflecting on the value of resistance, on the value of determination, of fighting to the death even, that's all, like in military history, an incredibly important chapter that must never be underestimated, nor for like the possible slaughter that is going to follow anyway, and defeat even of the most determined forces, but also the contrary, like, you know, what does this mean for those who fight these forces as well, in a broader historical, moral sense, so to say. It's always very complicated to easily describe this, but I'm sure that we're going to do something more in depth about the same Jewish warfare, the same Jewish wars, reading Josephus, etc., because these are the same years also of, you know, of Tacitus, for example, and we need to appreciate also different peoples, different parts of the empire, different parts of really Europe, the Mediterranean, the Levant, etc., in these essential qualities and what they were seeing the world like and why they would do such a thing. Like it's like the Jewish revolt. It's not something you can merely answer from a military point of view. A military point of view is the outcome of the let's say the war's beginning, let's say, but it's not really telling you the story, the full story, just by itself. It can make you measure the resolve, the determination. And the Romans, by the way, were determined like hell. So just we tell the story as, well, okay, well, the Jews were doomed since the beginning. We're not quite, in the sense that we understand, and we should never, in this sense, forget how and why an Italian people was able to take over the world in this and maintain it and showing off like this with this enormous, also logistical strains during the Jewish war, keeping up with this enormous military fort, just for showing the world how much they still got it. And they were right about it, by the way. So it's even more compelling, it's even more interesting, fascinating to look at. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.